Lukasz is a professor of architectural history at Tauman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. He is the author of Henri Lefebvre on Space, Architecture, Urban Research, and the Production of Theory, as well as of the book, which actually became the ultimate reason why we invited him here, which is the Architecture and Global Socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War. Previously, he taught at the Swiss Federal University of Technology, ETH, in Zurich, and at the University of Manchester in the UK. He was a guest professor at Harvard University and at the University of Ghana at Legon and Accra. So I'm very pleased to welcome Lukasz for his lecture, which is called Tashkent Modernism, A View from Africa. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Katia. I'm really happy to be here. People do say those things, don't they? And I know from experience that sometimes one is happy and sometimes one isn't. But today, I'm genuinely happy to be here because, as you will see, Tashkent plays an important role in my work. I'm going to start with this booklet. It is titled Soviet Uzbekistan Today. It was published by the Uzbek Society of Friendship and Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries in 1963. What is special about this particular copy is that it belonged to the president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana in 1957 became the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to free itself from a European colonial power, in this case, Britain. Now, in the 1960s, Ghana was a key location for Soviet diplomatic offensive in Africa and Asia in direct competition with the West. And this offensive entailed Soviet diplomatic, financial, and technological support for Ghana. In this framework, Soviet architects and engineers traveled to Accra, the capital of Ghana, to design industrial infrastructure, social facilities, and housing neighborhoods. But these trips were paralleled by the travels of Ghanaian professionals and politicians to the Soviet Union. And such visits almost always included Tashkent. Tashkent was showcased by the Soviets to numerous delegations from Africa and Asia as an example of socialist modernization in a non-European context shaped by Islam. And here you see one of the many newsreels that were produced on occasions of one of such meetings. And so the booklet, Soviet Uzbekistan Today, demonstrates another such visit, namely of a Ghanaian delegation. Tashkent and other Uzbek cities were presented as, quote, building sites where, quote, thousands of workers received keys to flats which were built at the state's expense. A modern construction was accompanied by preservation of ancient monuments in Samarkand and Bukhara. It also involved the development of kishlaks, which was translated for the Ghanaians as native villages. Ghanaian visitors visited one of the old kishlaks, consisting of narrow streets and windowless houses constructed from rammed earth, a technique that would reminded them of many villages in Ghana. By contrast, what is called in the booklet a Kishlak Reborn was a settlement of modern buildings with social services. After visiting the Chilanzar district of Tashkent, a textile mill, and a collective farm, the Ghanaian delegation was quoted to consider the Uzbek experience, quote, very useful for Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's president, agreed. As the journal Afrika Yazia Siewodnia reported, during his visit to Tashkent, Nkrumah stated that, quote, he was studying various aspects of the socialist system, the foundation of which he wished to lay in Ghana. Now, such statements could be very easily dismissed as Soviet Cold War propaganda directed at Africa, which the journal called a revolutionary continent. We could also see in such statements attempts by the Ghanaians to extract more resources from the Soviets. And neither critique would be unfounded. But today I want to revisit that view that Ghanaian view on Tashkent, and I will base this visit on Soviet and Ghanaian architectural archives. And in so doing, my aim is not only uncover a story that until recently has been largely forgotten by historians of architecture, and especially of modern architecture. I want to be more ambitious than that. My argument is that the study of architectural mobilities between Soviet Uzbekistan and West Africa during the Cold War helps us to reevaluate the significance of modern architecture in Tashkent. I want to argue that the view from Ghana, from West Africa, from the majority world is an opportunity to rethink the worldwide heritage and legacy of modern architecture. I want to reconsider them beyond the criteria that have dominated the history of our modern architecture during the last century. And I believe that my research contributes to this effort as it builds upon the work of many other architectural historians, most notably my mentor and friend, Jean-Louis Cohen. I will start with a broad overview of the architectural exchanges between the socialist countries and the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia during the Cold War. And I will do this by briefly presenting my recent book, which was mentioned by Katja, Architecture and Global Socialism. And that will offer an overview of the motivations, geographies, actors, and periodizations of these exchanges, and will allow to situate Tashkent within them. And I will then focus on the relationships between Ghana and Soviet Uzbekistan. I will present the Soviet argument that Tashkent offered an alternative to the architectural practices that were inherited by Ghanaians from the colonial period. The Soviet experience was presented as adaptable to the local conditions beyond Europe, and Tashkent was showcased as an example of such adaptation. And so the point was that if the Soviet model worked in Uzbekistan, it could also work in Ghana. Now, the Ghanaian response to this argument will be the focus on the last part of my talk. Ghanaian professionals and administrators were attracted to the Soviet expertise and the Soviet resources. And they were keen to learn from Tashkent. From their point of view, Tashkent undermined the hegemony of Britain as the provider of architectural expertise. Visits to the Uzbek capital offered an opportunity for them to reflect on the aims, needs, and means of architecture in Ghana. In short, when looking from Accra at Tashkent, many Africans discovered a multiplicity, heterogeneity, and antagonism intrinsic to modern architecture. And this will bring me to my conclusions. I will argue that the view from Accra on Tashkent is a vantage point to rewrite the history of modern architecture beyond the narratives inherited both from colonialism and the Cold War. So let me start with an overview of the collaboration between architects, planners, and construction companies from socialist Eurasia and their counterparts in West Africa and the Middle East during the Cold War. This was the focus of my book, Architecture and Global Socialism. It is a portrait of 5 cities: Accra, the capital of Ghana, Lagos in Nigeria, Baghdad in Iraq, Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait City. The book shows how these cities were co-produced by local actors and their counterparts from the socialist countries. So let me show you some images from the book that you have a better understanding of the material discussed. So this is the introduction, which shows the broad framework of these exchanges, but also discusses some of the precedents for Soviet presence in Africa and Asia, including projects in Mongolia and North Korea. This is the second chapter with a focus on Ghana and Accra with this modern architecture. And this ensemble, the International Trade Fair in Accra, is the main protagonist of this chapter. This is the following chapter focused on Lagos and Nigeria, which discusses, for instance, Hungarian projects about the countryside and the rural-urban continuum, but I also talk about, for example, very important Yugoslav designs for Lagos. This is the following chapter with this important document, the master plan of Baghdad, that was delivered by a Polish-Iraqi team with numerous sets of preparatory studies about urban housing typologies and so on. But I'm talking also about things like these, which is an East German military infrastructure in Baghdad and, for example, Romanian type housing projects for the Middle East. And this is the final chapter with this building, which is the Town and Country Planning Department in Abu Dhabi, which is a Bulgarian project, which was executed by a range of actors. But I also talk about, for example, here, a number of designs that were delivered by Eastern Europeans directly employed by private officers in the Gulf. And so already this brief overview shows that actors from socialist countries were part of an accelerated mobility of architecture after World War II. In recent years, many historians have studied these mobilities. They included late colonial and post-colonial networks from Western Europe, technical assistance from the United States, international organizations such as the United Nations, and networks of economic globalization. And so this book complements this scholarship by focusing on global networks of socialist countries, a topic which until recently has been completely absent in the historiography of architecture. And I think that this absence in itself is an interesting thing to reflect about. I think that one of the reasons for this absence was the difficulty in the access to sources. And so what this book brings to the table is a range of until unknown archival materials from Eastern Europe, from West Africa, and from the Middle East. But I believe that there is more. I believe that the key reasons for this absence has been Western triumphalism that, after the end of the Cold War, equated architecture's globalization with Westernization or Americanization, and then retroactively projected this narrative into the history of architecture since World War II, and in particular on the history of modern architecture. But in contrast, my book emphasizes the heterogeneity and multiplicity of networks which contributed to modern architecture becoming worldwide. And that included the heterogeneity and multiplicity of socialist networks themselves. I'm thinking here about the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, and then even earlier, the split between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Now, my thinking about these processes was influenced by several authors, and today I want to just mention one of them, namely Edouard Glissant. Glissant was a philosopher and a poet, and he lived in Martinique in France, but also in the US during and after the Cold War. His thinking was developed from within this cosmopolitan experience. And Glissant's question was this, and I think this is a really important question for the discussion here. Glissant's question was this: how do we think the modern world in ways that leaves behind concepts and images inherited from the colonial period? In other words, how do we think beyond expansionist concepts of the world and its imaginations in terms of frontiers to be conquered? In contrast to this way of thinking, Glissant wondered how to think the world when the thrust of the world and its desire no longer embolden you onward in a fever of discovery, then multiply you all around. So what is at stake here is how to think the world from within a multiplication of connections. And when constructing this concept of the global socialist, that this is in the title of my book, I was inspired by this thinking. Accordingly, by global socialism, I do not mean some kind of masterminded, uniform project. Rather, with this term, I refer to various ways of practicing the world by institutions and individuals from socialist countries and their local counterparts. These worlds were assembled in often incompatible ways. And I follow the official discourse of socialist internationalism as conveyed by posters such as these. But I also write about the production of global socialism from below. I look at actual encounters between people and the ways how they responded to these encounters, and these ways very often transgressed the official discourse of socialist internationalism. Global socialism remained between the descriptive and the normative, but it produced frameworks of interaction and exchange of very real things, among them architectural resources. And this understanding of global socialism informed the structure of the book. The opening of the socialist countries towards the decolonizing countries resulted from a shift in Soviet policy in the 1950s. Under Nikita Khrushchev's decree of peaceful coexistence, the Soviet offered political, economic, and technical assistance to African and Asian countries. Some African leaders, including here Kwame Nkrumah, in Ghana, were attracted by the Soviet offer, and they used it to embark on the path of socialist development. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. However, collaboration with socialist countries was attractive also to those African and Asian governments that did not follow a socialist development path. And among them was Nigeria. Nigerian elites' indifference to Ghana were generally hostile towards socialism. They invited Eastern Europeans not in order to build socialism, but rather in order to stimulate competition between foreign enterprises and to fill shortages of labor. And this is important because it shows that architectural mobilities within global socialism reached far beyond Soviet client states. Accordingly, rather than referring to socialism, Eastern European architects working in Nigeria on projects such as these sought for other ways to make sense of their tasks at hand. And in particular, they shared that they pointed at the shared experience of foreign domination over Eastern Europe and Africa during the long 19th century. They claimed that it contributed to economic backwardness and cultural dependency of both regions. And they argued that a specific Eastern European planning experience, in particular pertaining to the questions of the countryside and of the rural areas, that this experience was relevant for Nigerians. And so in this way, the chapter on Nigeria shows that Eastern Europeans instrumentalized these historical analogies between Eastern Europe and West Africa. But importantly, this chapter also reveals the limits to these analogies and the racialized inequalities that were intrinsic to global socialism. What reverberated in these dynamics were the ambiguities of Eastern Europe's own colonial history, notably the history of the so-called internal colonization in Tsarist Russia, but also in other countries such as Poland. Now, the Eastern European countries had their own ideological aims, geopolitical objectives, and economic interests to engage with West Africa and the Middle East. And these aims and objectives were evolving from the 1950s to the 1980s, and they differed from country to country. An important threshold in this context was the oil embargo of 1973. The profits of oil-producing countries which were deposited in the West were then lent to socialist countries intent on modernizing their economies. Yet the industrial leap that would have allowed them to pay back this debt never materialized. And so Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany responded by boosting their exports to obtain convertible currencies. And that included the export of design and construction services, for example, here in Libya. And this political economy of socialism as it actually existed is the focus on the chapter on Baghdad and the collaboration between Eastern Europeans and Iraqi architects, planners, and contractors in Iraq. It shows how they instrumentalized the differences between the emerging global market of construction and design services on the one hand, and on the other, the political economy of state socialism. And specifically, I'm looking at things like the inconvertibility of Eastern European currencies, but also, for instance, and the principle of barter, so the exchange of good for good without the use of money. For example, petrobarter, so the exchange of buildings for oil. Now, the last chapter focuses on the work of architects from socialist countries in the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait during the final decade of the Cold War. By discussing dealings such as these, I show how actors from the socialist countries became integrated into the Western-dominated market of design and construction services in the Gulf. Evidently, this integration was uneven and unequal. But the argument of the chapter is that it was based on their previous experiences in North Africa and the Middle East in the networks of socialist or internationalism. And so by focusing on the Gulf, this book inscribed socialist internationalism into a more heterogeneous and an ambivalent genealogy of architecture's globalization at the turn of the century. And so this broad overview pointed at a couple of things, but I think what is perhaps most important for what follows is that it shows a differentiation of architectural exchanges in global socialism. It signaled the values and changing motivations of the governments and institutions involved. It emphasized that the socialist countries were not a homogenous Soviet bloc, and certainly neither were their counterparts in Africa and Asia. In particular, these African and Asian countries were very rarely Soviet satellites or client states. And this certainly pertains to Ghana during the 1960s, to which I am going to turn now. In the wake of World War II, the Gold Coast colony, which was the British name for Ghana, embarked on a fast-track program of investments in economic and social development. Architecture and construction played a crucial role in this program, as exemplified by this 1958 map of Accra, the capital. Many buildings were designed in the idiom of so-called tropical architecture. This was a term used by British modernist architects who aimed at adapting the practice of British modernism to tropical regions. Architects such as Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew and many others pointed at three aspects of such adaptation. They included local climate, materials and technologies, and social needs and aspirations. And here you can see some of the designs. This architecture relied on British design precedents, and it was largely built from British or imported construction materials. Now, independence of Ghana in 1957 meant a radical opening of the country towards the world beyond the British Empire. And that, was a common everyday experience for Ghanaians. They noticed on the streets of Accra new types of objects and for example, cars they had never seen before, such as Soviet Volgas or Moskvich. They visited trade exhibitions of countries across Cold War divides, and they also noticed a string of foreign experts arriving to Accra. Among them were professionals in architecture, planning, engineering, and construction. Professionals from France, West Germany, Italy, and Greece were arriving, as well as from United States, including African Americans. During the 1960s, the number of Ghanaian architects grew exponentially. They were educated abroad and then increasingly in Ghana at this place, the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. Its modernist campus was designed first by British architects and then by Yugoslav and Ghanaian architects. And this cosmopolitan environment was further expanded by architects, planners, engineers, and foremen from the socialist countries, such as the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland. Here on the right, you can see a visit of Soviet planners to the city of Tema in Ghana. Besides the Soviet camp, other visions of socialism were represented too, with China present and with various countries of the non-aligned movement, of which Ghana was a founding member. What is really interesting and very relevant is that architects from socialist countries were directly employed by Ghanaian institutions. And among them was the Ghana National Construction Corporation, or the GNCC, headed by the Ghanaian architect Victor Adegbite. And I will come back to Adegbite later. Architects from socialist countries were the core design team of the GNCC, and in this capacity they designed a large number of buildings, among them these. Eastern European architects were arriving to Accra in the wake of agreements signed by Ghana with the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. The shift towards a socialist economy, which was pursued by President Nkrumah since the early 60s, involved a very large construction program, including collective farms, investments in food and textile industry, as well as school, health, cultural facilities. These investments were supported by technical assistance, bartering agreements, and favorable credits from the socialist countries. Now, in the negotiations with the Ghanaians, the Soviets argued that the basic principles of socialist planning were the same everywhere. However, Soviet planners stressed, quote, that specific solutions differed by countries in accordance with their economic, historical, and other conditions and characteristics. Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and Tashkent were presented as an example of how Soviet architectural resources were adapted to such conditions and characteristics beyond Europe. Among them, climate was considered central. And this was the point made by Anatoly Nikolaevich Rimsha, planner and co-designer of the master plan of Kabul in Afghanistan in the 1960s. In his book, which you see here, Urban Planning in the Conditions of Hot Climate, Rimsha often referred to Tashkent, and you see some of illustrations from Tashkent in his book. In so doing, he aimed to show at how Soviet planning and architecture accommodated the climatic conditions of Uzbekistan. And Rimsha argued that this experience had a broader relevance beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. As an evidence, he included this map to his book. It showed regions which shared with the Soviet Union, or with Soviet Central Asia rather, the hot, dry climate. And among these countries, as you can see, were Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Mali, Ethiopia, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Mongolia, and Chile. Soviet architects and planners worked in all these countries in the 1960s and 1970s. A similar point was made by this map, which was on the cover of the Journal of Problems of Desert Development, published by the Academy of Sciences of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic. So maps like these two conveyed the very clear message that the Soviet climatic research and the architectural research based on that climatic research and the planning experience from Central Asia were relevant globally. Evidently, Ghana does not share the climatic conditions with Uzbekistan. But attention to climatic concerns that characterize the adaptation of Soviet typologies in Tashkent was central for the Soviet engagements with Ghana. And that was another important point that was made by Rimsha in one of his publications. He demonstrated how the Soviet typology of the mikrorayon was adaptable to various local conditions. And as evidence, he juxtaposed these two plans. On the one hand, on the right, a mikrorayon in Tashkent, and on the left, a mikrorayon in Ghana, which was designed by the Soviets in the 1960s. The latter showed how, in response to the hot, wet climate, which was the Ghanaian climate, the urban layout was open to the breeze from the ocean. The plans of the apartments were modified to allow cross-ventilation, and I will come back to that Soviet project later. Several Soviet scholars and practitioners who began their careers in Uzbekistan traveled later to Africa. Among them was the scholar Veronika Voronina, who studied historical architecture in Uzbekistan on the left, and then refocused her work entirely on architecture in tropical Africa on the right. And here you see some images from her book on national traditions in the architecture in Uzbekistan. Voronina's attention not only to buildings, but also to the urban contexts, to townscapes, to vegetation, to water, to detailing and materiality, continued in her work in Ghana. So all these themes you can see in her writings about Ghana. Perhaps the first of these writings was an essay that was published in a series of essays by the main Soviet architectural journal, Arhitektura SSSR, in 1964. The article gave informative account of architecture in Ghana, including vernacular or pre-colonial, colonial, and post-independence buildings. Voronina described the ways in which architects and planners on the ground responded to the climatic conditions of the humid climatic zone. And for example, her later work, he picked specific examples, and this is one of them, a British-designed bank in the Ghanaian city of Sekondi Takoradi. And so these examples were meant to be instructive for Soviet architects arriving to Ghana. But this research methodology, which I briefly presented, was not only used by the Soviets, it was also used by Ghanaian architects and scholars. And perhaps the most advanced study among them is the PhD dissertation by the Ghanaian architect Eric George Alexander Don Arthur. This dissertation was written at the Moscow Architectural Institute. Don Arthur was one of many Ghanaians who studied architecture in Moscow and other Soviet cities. It was titled Selected Questions of Mass Housing Construction in the Climatic Conditions of Ghana. Don Arthur developed a fine-grained climatic regionalization of Ghana and studied various indigenous building cultures across climatic regions in the country. He charted the environmental performance of diverse housing types according to changing times of the day and changing seasons of the year. Based on vernacular and colonial precedents, he reviewed and proposed design answers to such questions as radiation, insulation, and rainfall. And he studied them on the scale of a room, of a house, of a neighborhood, and of a city. During his studies in the Soviet Union, Don Arthur traveled to Uzbekistan, and he made frequent references to Tashkent in his work. Yet for him, the Soviet experience in the region was relevant beyond climatic concerns. This experience also testified to the distinct character of Soviet architecture and planning. According to Don Arthur and many other Soviet authors, such as Rimsha, such as Voronina, this distinct character of Soviet planning was captured by the concepts of national traditions and ways of life. These concepts conveyed the Soviet understanding of post-colonial difference. It was based on a dialectical vision of socialist modernization, according to which the past needed to be both destroyed and preserved as a modernizing resource. In Central Asia, these attempts stemmed from Soviet ethnographic debates, and they were instrumental in the planning of Tashkent, including the mikrorayony, based on mahalat, so the traditional social spatial unit of Uzbek communal life. By the late 1960s, that included, for example, the experimental housing neighborhood in Tashkent, here the C27, and then they were followed by many others, as you know. Scholars, notably Boris Chukovich, have shown that the concept of national tradition, especially as applied in Uzbekistan, was never free of racialized fantasies, paternalistic attitudes, and formulaic uses. Yet when presented to Ghanaians during the 1960s, these concepts were meant to signal respect for African traditions and cultures. And this contrasted with the devalorization of these cultures and traditions in the framework of Western colonialism. In this way, they were inscribed into a broader Soviet claim about the Soviet Union as an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist power. In this narrative, Central Asia was presented as a territory liberated by the Soviet from Tsarist colonialism. Such claims permeated Soviet architectural publications. They conveyed a promise of an equal or more equal relationship with the Ghanaian counterparts. For example, writing for Architektura SSSR, Voronina mentioned the names of several Ghanaian architects and artists, such as on the left, Kofi Antumbam, and on the right, Victor Adegbite. She declared, and I quote, that their designs could be used for the planning of housing in the southern regions of the Soviet Union. And this very much contrasted with the tone of British publications from that period, which focused entirely on British architects. British publications about Ghana. Soviet professionals arriving to Ghana made a visible effort to signal that more equitable relationship with Ghanaians, for example, by refusing to hire servants. And this had architectural consequences too. And for example, these bungalows in the northern Ghanaian city of Tamale were housing Soviet specialists, and they were based on a colonial typology, but the servants' quarters were removed. However, Soviet anti-racist claims were widely contested in Ghana. During the 1960s, Soviet propaganda material such as this was published in Ghanaian press, sometimes right next to accounts about racially motivated attacks on Africans in the Soviet Union. That included one particularly important incident in which a Ghanaian student died in Moscow, which was then followed by a demonstration organized by African students on the Red Square. More critical visitors to Soviet Uzbekistan noticed the unequal relationship between the Uzbek and the European populations. In this way, they wondered if the Soviet Union was a gravedigger of the Tsarist Empire, or rather its successor. Everyday contacts with Soviet and state socialist professionals working in Ghana made it clear to Ghanaians that Eastern Europeans were not free of racial prejudice. In response, prominent advisors to President Nkrumah, such as the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist George Padmo and the African-American historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, drew parallels between the Soviet presence in Africa and that of Western European colonial powers. And this skepticism towards the Soviets and the Eastern Europeans extended also to the architectural offer. That, in particular, included Ghanaians of elite backgrounds who were educated in the former colonial metropolises. When studying in Britain, some among them had absorbed the British racialized perception of Eastern Europeans as Western Europe's first Orient. Such perception found a second life in Cold War Western propaganda, which devalorized Soviet and Eastern European expertise as it was offered to Ghanaians. So as you see, it's a complex situation, and the question is like, where does it leave us in respect to this question that is informing this talk, right? The question to, was the Uzbek experience really relevant for Ghana as claimed by a range of Ghanaian delegations that visited Tashkent? It is very clear that many Ghanaian decision makers were attracted to the promise of an accelerated development of the construction industry, and they knew that Soviet technology, expertise, and personnel would be very instrumental in accelerating that development. And Krumach's advisors wanted to use these resources to expedite the welfare program on which the mass support of the government depended. And Soviet Central Asia was an example of how that could be done in a context which a Ghanaian journalist described, quote, a little bit like tropical Africa. Yet in response to the Soviet offer, decision makers in Accra made it clear that they did not seek to replace an old colonial master for a new one. For example, when asked by a journalist about the Soviet projects in Ghana, an official in Accra assured the public, quote, that the government was in full and absolute control of every single project. Rather than accepting the Soviet proposal, professionals and administrators in Accra negotiated and modified them. In so doing, they often juxtaposed Soviet resources with those available in Ghana, whether inherited from the colonial period or arriving to the country from different directions. And such negotiations started already with the technical standards for projects carried out in Ghana by Soviet organizations. This document. It was prepared in 1962 in Moscow, but then these standards were revised by the Ghanaian architect E.Y.S. Engman and the Ministry of Public Works in Accra. Engman compared the Soviet standards with the colonial practice in Ghana and modified them. And then his modifications were translated into Russian, and they were then included into the revised guidelines. Ghanaian architects were also involved in the negotiation of the largest Soviet projects in Ghana. And that included the factory of prefabricated concrete panels in Accra and two mikrorayone in the cities of Accra and Tema, which you see on the screen. The factory was based on the Soviet prefabrication system called 1464, a system that was widely used and adapted in the Soviet Union to various climatic regions and seismic regions. And that adaptations included Tashkent, where in the wake of the 1966 earthquake, the Zonal Design Institute adapted the 1464 system to the seismic risks. Design elements from this Tashkent system, notably the shading panels, were directly included into the set of elements that were produced by the panel factory in Accra. And you can see the list of elements here. The factory was completed in 1966, and the building is still standing, as you can see on this slide, but it does not produce concrete elements anymore. Minutes from Moscow archives show direct involvement of Ghanaians into the design process. In its course, Soviet engineers added, a number of modifications to the Soviet precedents. That included, for instance, an additional protective layer to the wall elements and an additional waterproofing layer. The floor plans of the buildings did not follow a standard Soviet layout of 2 rooms of breadth. Rather, as you can see, these, again, from a Soviet perspective, these plans were very unusual because they were a single room in breadth with 2 external longitudinal load-bearing walls. This modification secured the cross-ventilation of every room in the building. And further modifications followed. For example, a cooking porch was added to every apartment in order to allow for the West African practice of outdoor cooking. It were Ghanaians who argued for these modifications, and in so doing, they referred to the concepts of national traditions and ways of life. And that suggests the argumentative, if not explanatory, value of these concepts. The implementation of these projects was interrupted by the coup that toppled Nkrumah in 1966. A few years later, the buildings were constructed with further modifications, and they were constructed on the basis of the Soviet prefabrication system in the city of Tema, and you see this here from my very recent visit. And so, before I conclude, let me reflect on this material to speculate about what did Ghanaians see when they looked at Tashkent. Professionals and administrators in Ghana were key to put Soviet resources to work in Ghana. In this context, modern architecture in Tashkent was seen as a crucial example of implementing Soviet architectural resources in a location that shared with Ghana a distance from European precedents and conditions. And thus, as I argued, that distance was charted on a broad spectrum ranging from climatic conditions to ethnographic coordinates. In other words, Tashkent represented not a model to emulate, but a practice to learn from. But the relevance of Tashkent did not end here. Ghanaian professionals did not want to replace Britain with the Soviet Union as a source of authoritative architectural knowledge. They did not simply accept that positions of those adapting Soviet resources to the conditions of Ghana, just like the tropical architects were adapting British modernism to the conditions of the colony. Ghanaian architects work in different ways, and rather than adaptive, their practice might be called generative. Take the work of the Ghanaian architect Victor Adegbite as an example, and here you see him on his trip to the Soviet Union, a trip which included Tashkent. Adegbite juxtaposed Soviet resources with the resources that Ghana inherited from the colonial period. He questioned one against the other, and with yet other architectural resources that were arriving to Accra during the 1960s. For Adegbite and other professionals, ideological considerations mattered less than the imperative to deploy Soviet resources within governmental investment programs. Crucially, Adegbite was not simply choosing between foreign examples. It was not a sort of supermarket type of situation. The view on Tashkent was, for him, an opportunity to reflect on Ghana's own aims and the means to answer them. Adegbite used his cosmopolitan experience to formulate a set of criteria according to which he evaluates these foreign resources offered to Ghana and the priorities of the adaptation. Some of these criteria, such as climatic concerns, were turned into or were tuned into British and Soviet practices, but others respected specifically Ghanaian directives, such as, for example, the principle of import substitution, which then included the priority of locally produced materials. Yet others addressed the differentiation of the Ghanaian society along ethnic and class lines. These criteria informed Adegbite's own work, including these prototypes and experimental houses in Accra. Adegbite and other Ghanaian architects experienced this practice of comparing and negotiating foreign resources as emancipatory. This practice promised to be based on evidence rather than on a hierarchy of prestige, whether Soviet or British. It put Africans into the position of appraisers of metropolitan knowledge, whether coming from London or from Moscow. At several occasions, these decision makers stress their freedom of choice, and they enjoy doing so. For example, in 1961, a Ghanaian official rejected an offer from an Eastern European state company, and in the rejection letter, he wrote, quote, "We can obtain consultancy services from almost every country in the world. Under the form of agreements proposed by you, a great deal of freedom of selection would be removed." However, that freedom often proved to be illusory. There were risks related to the lack of experience of the Soviets in West Africa. There was a danger of technological and economic dependency on the Soviet Union, and other constraints included those which were inherited from the colonial period. For example, London-based institutions continued to regulate parts of Ghana's international trade, including the country's barter agreements with the Soviets. And these constraints only exacerbated after the coup that toppled Nkrumah in 1966. By the 1980s, there was hardly any mention of Tashkent in the Ghanaian press. By then, the Soviet discourse of anti-colonialism was undermined by the war in Afghanistan and by the reports of environmental crisis in Soviet Central Asia. So as you see, the Ghanaian experience of looking at Tashkent was short-lived, but I believe that we can learn a lot from it. When seen from Ghana, Tashkent revealed the multiplicity, the heterogeneity, and the antagonism of modern architecture. And that included modernism's resistance to be owned by one particular ideological system. It was that very multiplicity and heterogeneity that, according to Glisson, characterized the world emerging from decolonization. And I think that this reference to Glisson shall suggest that there is a bigger point here and a bigger stake. The trajectories that connected Accra and Tashkent can help us to rethink in new ways 20th century modernism as a worldwide phenomenon. Glisson, as you remember, argued that the world after colonialism needs to be reconceptualized beyond colonial era expansionist concepts. And yet these expansionist concepts very often continue to inform the work of architectural historians of the 20th century modernism. They manifest themselves in a tendency to extend geographies of modern architecture beyond its presumably core examples in Western Europe and in North America. In this way, new chapters are added to old books, but the structure of these books, their criteria, their systems of value remain unchanged. And this is problematic, as some of them directly stem from colonial scholarship and its racialized concepts. Among them, to give one example, is Sir Bannister Fletcher's Global History of Architecture, which has just received a new edition. All these attempts, often genuinely useful, tend to reinforce the image of the world of modern architecture as divided into centers and peripheries. In this world, architectural resources, knowledge, and innovation are diffused from centers, and then they are absorbed in the majority world. This conceptual framework reproduces the hierarchy of value and significance of modern architecture, often along colonial and racialized patterns. And so my point today is not so much that Tashkent should be recognized as one more center of modern architecture. My point is that Tashkent helps us to leave behind an architectural history of centers and peripheries. In other words, the focus on modern architecture in Tashkent can help us to rewrite architectural history beyond its expansionist and diffusionist concepts. Such rewriting recognizes the multiplicities of worldwide modernism, but it does so without omitting or obscuring its geopolitical hegemonies and power dependencies, whether stemming from the colonial period or the Cold War period. The view from Accra on Tashkent revealed these hegemonies, and I have stressed them today. And yet, the same view helps us to recognize the potential of multilateral encounters as a way to triangulate these hegemonies and to triangulate the conceptual binaries that come with them. It does so by paying attention to an architectural culture on the ground and the agencies, however constraints, of those producing it. And that included in my talk the comparative and generative practices of architects such as Victor Adegbite. During the 1960s, Tashkent offered many lessons to Accra. The view from Accra on Tashkent and its modern architecture might be one lesson worth bringing back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lukasz, for an amazing lecture and very actually profound statements. It's so dense that I think everybody will need some time to process, but really, really pertinent to what we're saying. If somebody has the courage to start asking questions.
I'm sure you have.
We have buddies, right?
Thank you very much, Lukasz, for this amazing conference. Yeah, I would like. I accept your sentence that Tashkent was not a model but experience to learn. Obviously, one of many for Africans and for inhabitants of Ghana in particular. I would like to know when the architectural education in Ghana started, and if I would like to know if students from Ghana learned in some period of time in Tashkent, architecture in Tashkent Polytechnical Institute, and if after that maybe some lessons from Tashkent professors were learned and transported to Ghana practices.
Thanks a lot, Boris. So the architectural education in Ghana has a very interesting history. It started in 1959, so 2 years after independence. And but the structure of the education was very much shaped by the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and by the AA, the Architectural Association. And so there is this contrast between the country being opened towards the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in terms of, you know, who works in the state design offices in Accra and Kumasi and other places, and that architectural education that was very much informed by the colonial precedent and by the colonial metropole. Now, you know, this also is in a way very specific for the type of condition that I'm describing, and it's really relevant for my argument, showing that Ghanaians were not simply choosing one or the other, but were in themselves on sort of crossroads. And that crossroads and that ability to choose was very often constrained. As I said, this is not a sort of a complete freedom of choice. And so you see a number of these path dependencies also in the architectural education. And some of them really became too rigid. And so in the mid-1960s, when the first cohort of Ghanaian students all failed the exams, so, the exams which were checked by the RIBA in London, it was then when the Ghanaian decided to break up with this model and to establish an independent architectural school. There were some Soviet scholars who taught in Kumasi. There were several Eastern Europeans, that included Soviets. There were several Eastern Europeans in the architectural department. I don't believe that there were any Soviet educators in the architectural departments. Now, what you suggested is very important, because it was not so much that the Ghanaian students from Kumasi would travel to the Soviet Union, but there was a handful. There was around 12 to 15 Ghanaians who received scholarships to study in the Soviet Union. Don Arthur, whom I quoted, was one of them. He went to Moscow. There were others, and some of this is an ongoing research project, so I don't know whether there was somebody who studied in Tashkent. There was certainly 2 people who studied in Kiev, but from my interviews with these Ghanaian architects, who until many of them until recently were still around, they definitely mentioned visits to Tashkent. So that was a kind of standard part of the architecture education in the Soviet Union. But again, whether there was somebody who specifically studied in Tashkent, that I would need to do more research to answer that.
I actually have a question, maybe a bit naive. Maybe Davide will laugh at me now, but I wanted to ask you, in relation to our last session, so this concept of multiplicity that you've talked about, and I think you've described quite eloquently this idea that Tashkent was not a model. If we now need to translate this into the UNESCO terminology of the outstanding universal value, how would that work? Or is that concept, in its actually inherent kind of meaning, is actually against the notion of singular objects becoming or being called something outstanding? And it works on completely different principles.
I do think that this was an exceptional, outstanding place for not only for Ghana, but also for other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think that we can think about that status in terms of influences. We don't need to argue that outstanding character of Tashkent by claiming that the experiences of Tashkent influence the whole world. What I was trying to do was develop a more nuanced argument by showing how to be relevant you don't need to influence. You can show an alternative, and you in a way encourage to look for yet other alternatives, right? That was basically the argument. And in that process, I do not think that there was any other city that would play that role more than Tashkent. In all the archival materials and all the memories and all the interviews that I gathered in a few sub-Saharan countries.
So in that sense, you think this could be applicable as an argument?
Well, let's not put it down on paper yet, but I do think we have to see whether this is a convincing argument, right? And in a way, this is an opportunity to test that argument. If people aren't convinced, if informed scholars aren't convinced that we can think about relevance beyond that art historical concept of influence, whether we can think about relevance in different terms. This is a conceptual work, and we have to do that conceptual work.
It's very interesting, and I'd like to pass the microphone actually to Davide to elaborate, but I somehow see it as actually being the opposite of that notion. But
or this will relate, so it is not time to question, but maybe just a few comments and remarks for this brilliant lecture, which I think is well positioned very well in our program, and which I think helps us pretty much to overcome the idea of a limited number of poles in the debate.
Oh, sorry, could you repeat that?
I think that your contribution helps us in overcoming the idea of a very limited number of poles in the debate, 1 or 2, maybe 3, but perhaps this part of the world, due to the geographical position and to the recent, but not only the recent history, as inherently a multiplicity, as you said, of relationship. In architecture, of course, that is our subject, but perhaps not only. And so the direction to be explored, perhaps the one towards Ghana will be not the last one. Any others?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lukasz, for a great lecture. I have actually two questions for you. Maybe one is a comment on the last, question of, of influence. I have to say that I agree actually with Lukasz that we have to look at, influence from a more complex perspective. The fact that you were able to have oral histories, that many West African architects were looking at Tashkent. They didn't need to come here and have, classes, etc. You even find architects that studied in, Europe or in the Soviet Union from Africa, but yet would have used the influence a completely different way. So I think that the fact that West African architects were looking at Tashkent, came to visit it, maybe left some, oral history. That's a testimony that it actually did represent maybe something novel. And myself, coming here for the first time, and being an African, architect as well, looking at how the architecture was blended with local specificities, specifically Islamic tradition, was extremely unique, and I could totally understand how this type of modernism could have been fascinating to show that a different model of modernism was possible. So that was my first comment. The second one for you is when you did this, interviews, were there any buildings in particular that this architect remembered or any technique that really surprised them and stayed with them? And finally, including the integration of art and decorative art, which I think the type of, like modernism that we see here in Tashkent and more at large in the Soviet Union is much more comfortable inviting artists to contribute to their architecture. And I was wondering in Ghana if you've seen this experience, because in Senegal, definitely in the international fair, artists were invited to work on facades, something that you see here. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Again, I think that the kind of clearest examples of direct references are coming from publications or writings such as Don Arthur, right? And there you see very specific examples, and these again, as you remember, that dissertation, that PhD dissertation was about housing, and so these were several examples of housing projects that he mentioned and referred to, and again, even broad, even in a more narrow sense, he looked at the climatic responsiveness and all the architectural technology that comes with it. And so, it's a very good dissertation. It means it's very focused. And so, so these are the types of references that one can find in his work. And you are absolutely right. I think that this mode of working where architecture makes space for art, and that also means a very specific type of division of labor and very specific type, appreciation of local labor that is not reduced, to blue-collar workers, but actually includes intellectual labor. That was something that was very specific to Soviet and more broadly, I would think state socialist interventions. Perhaps the first example I think about is something as a building I'm sure that's the National Theatre in Lagos, which is this massive piece over the Makoko Lagoon, which is the one building you cannot miss when you travel to Lagos, when you go to Lagos Island through the Third Mainland Bridge. That's the building you see, and you see it from many other places. And this is a building which is really a kind of a true testimony, and if you like, an homage to Nigerian painting, to Nigerian sculpture, to Nigerian graphic art, to arts and crafts, and and that was very intentional.
Lukasz. Thank you again. You know how much I appreciate your work, and I don't want to ruin a little bit idyllic a vision of this methodology that somehow the Ghanese architects take. But we have also to say that this process of inserting localism in the most wide way is a process that is already happening in the entire Western world, because the modernism is in its crisis already in these years, and many countries, Western and non-Western, I would like to ask you to contextualize a little bit in which way this story, without ruining the idea of the colonization, post-colonization, but in fact it's a thematic that the entire world is proceeding, starting from South America to the different other countries and so on, as a cultural global phenomenon.
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
My point is that the work of mapping a completely different geography of the cultural transfers and technical transfer, which you have marvelously done in your work and also today, can be contextualized also in a global phenomena of the contextualism, regionalism in general, that is spreading maybe
Okay.
10 years before already on a global scale, no?
Yeah. No, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, right, I listed a number of fields of scholarship that studied architectural mobilities, right? So and there is a lot of work on late colonial and post-colonial exchanges with Western Europe, right? And there is work on humanitarianism, on architecture within the networks of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and UNESCO, and so on. There's a lot of work. So and that focus, there's nothing new besides the fact that that now the actors are different, and what I I guess one could go to different directions with with answering your question. I will just explore two directions. First, I quite often get the question whether there was something specifically socialist about these exchanges, and I'm not sure if this is the direction that you aimed at. And to that, I have two answers. The first is that, there were examples such as Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah where these resources were aimed at implementing an economy and a society inspired by socialism. That included industrialization, that included mass mobilization of the society, that included central planning, and so on and so on. But I think that this is not the most relevant thing. What makes these exchanges specific? What I argue that what made these exchanges specific, although not in a way that you can recognize that specificity perhaps by the shape of windows, is the political economy of foreign trade in state socialism. And I hinted at this argument when I discussed the chapter about the Middle East, where the fact that Eastern European currencies were unconvertible, I argue, had a massive impact on their way of working on the ground, the organization of labor on the ground, and hence, it did not come with specific methodologies, but it made some methodologies possible, which would not have been possible in a kind of more capitalist-oriented division of labor and organization of labor. And another principle is the principle of barter. The principle of barter is not an exclusively socialist principle. I think Italy bartered oil with Iraq at one point in the 80s. But it is very clear that that was the favored way of foreign trade, especially in the Comecon countries, and then in countries which were associated with the Comecon, with the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, the economic organization of the socialist countries, especially countries that were also affiliated with the Comecon, like Iraq. Right? And so that principle of bartering, which did influence, again, the materiality of buildings, the program of buildings, the way how the construction site was organized, the relationship with the local counterparts, the types of division of labor that made it possible, right? So again, the argument is not that they were exporting socialism, but I think I have no doubt about this, that political economy made certain things possible and made certain things impossible. That is something that I believe is relevant for this discussion. Now, in terms of that integrate, because I'm not sure if your immediate question was about that integration of art and buildings in the work of Eastern Europeans and their counterparts. That was obviously not particularly a unique phenomenon, but again, because of the way how this political economy worked, because of the bartering exchanges where, for example, again, Soviet cement was bartered for Ghanaian cocoa, in that framework opened up certain possibilities and again closed others.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay, now I have the last question. Sorry. Nicholas Banner, I'm quite intrigued by the debate just now. It's really fascinating. And my main question is, had there been, so did the Western states simply surrender? And did they say, okay, Ghana is doing this with the socialist state and all this? Or is there a similar politics from Western states which are not directly colonialist state, like Germany in that time, were not directly in the decolonization in the 1950s, 60s involved. So, for instance, Germany or the United States, did they have a similar politics to showcase some cities which were interesting, for instance, for the new coming African states?
Oh yes, absolutely. One of my key sources, and that's a response to the fragmentation and congruity of the post-colonial archives, are newspapers. So I have read a lot of Ghanaian newspapers day by day from the 1960s, and you do see quite a lot of presentations and media articles that were planted by all sorts of embassies, and that included, of course, West Germany and the United States. The United States have a very particular and interesting relationship because, of course, I don't know if you remember, I have shown briefly the work of an African-American architect, a rather famous architect in the United States. His name was Max Bond. And he responded to an invitation by President Nkrumah because he wanted to contribute to the development of Ghana, which was very inspiring, but also because he faced racism in the United States. And that context of the Jim Crow laws in the US was very strong, and as historians have shown, it is in the context of decolonization that put pressure on undoing of that system. In terms of West Germany, in the context of socialist Ghana, their presence was less visible, perhaps because of the close relationship between Ghana and East Germany and the Hallstein Doctrine, which prohibited relationships with countries that recognized East Germany. However, again, now in the archives, I have seen several exchanges of letters related to West German machinery or other types of purchases. So these exchanges definitely existed too.
Thank you. Then I would say we can wrap up here. Thank you again, Lukasz, for really interesting, inspiring, and very profound lecture. And thank you, everybody, for coming here and for your interest and your patience. We will keep you informed about our next steps. But for tonight, we're done. So thank you very much.